George Harrison didn't just walk out of a recording session, he left the Beatles. At least for a few days, long enough to shake the band to its core. It happened in the middle of January 1969 inside a cold, unwelcoming studio at Twickenham Film Studios. The band had come together to rehearse new material for a project called Get Back, but the atmosphere was already toxic. John was distracted, Yoko was present at every moment, Paul was taking over everything, and Ringo, he was just trying to hold it all together. But George had reached his limit. And the breaking point? A song. Not even his own song, it was Paul McCartney's song. A song Paul insisted on perfecting. A song he kept playing over and over, telling George how to play his guitar part. Until finally, George stood up and said, "I'm leaving the band now." And then he walked out. No drama, no screaming, just cold rejection. The cameras caught everything, but they didn't capture what it meant. George's decision to walk out didn't come from nowhere. It had been building for years. Since the early days of Beatlemania, he was always seen as the quiet Beatle, the one who followed rather than led. But as the band evolved, so did George. He had grown as a songwriter, as a musician, and as a person. Yet in the studio, he was still treated like the junior member. Paul McCartney's control over the band had become increasingly suffocating. During the White Album sessions, Paul took it upon himself to lead, sometimes recording tracks without the others, sometimes re-recording their parts. George noticed it, and it stung. While John was drifting further into his own world, often one that included Yoko Ono at his side, Paul was stepping into the vacuum and dominating the creative process. By January 1969, tensions were no longer just under the surface. The sessions for Get Back were being filmed, and instead of making things better, the cameras only amplified the discomfort. George hated being filmed while writing. It made everything feel forced, artificial. He was expected to produce brilliance on command while also following orders from Paul and navigating John's detachment. The breaking point came during rehearsals for two of us. Paul had written it, and though it sounds innocent enough, he was relentless about how he wanted it played. He repeatedly told George what to do with his guitar parts, even demonstrating them himself. George, trying to stay composed, pushed back subtly, but it was clear he was growing resentful. Every correction, every suggestion chipped away at his patience. Then came the moment. After yet another tense exchange, George snapped. Not loudly, not violently. He simply looked at the others and said something blunt, final. He was leaving the band, and he walked out. The band was stunned. They continued playing for a few moments, as if trying to pretend it hadn't happened. But it had, and the reality was sinking in fast. George was gone, and for the first time, the Beatles truly felt like they might not survive. The rest of that day was filled with awkward silences and uncertain glances. Paul tried to keep things going, suggesting they continue working. John seemed to care less, already emotionally distant. Ringo said little. Without George, the chemistry was broken. The magic was missing. Behind closed doors, the conversations turned serious. There was talk of bringing in Eric Clapton to replace George. That wasn't a joke. John floated the idea, and no one laughed. That's how fragile things had become. The idea of swapping out a Beatle didn't seem impossible anymore. But the truth was they needed George more than they admitted. He had evolved into a vital, creative force. Songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Something were proof. He was no longer the shy kid from Liverpool. He had ideas, and he wanted space to explore them. The Beatles weren't giving him that space. A few days later, George returned. But it wasn't because everything was fixed. It was because they negotiated. He agreed to come back only if the Get Back sessions were moved from Twickenham to Apple Studios, where he felt more comfortable. The band also had to agree to cancel the big live performance Paul had been pushing. George wasn't interested in a spectacle. He wanted music, not drama. Even after his return, the energy had shifted. The damage was done. George's walkout had exposed the deep fractures within the group. Trust had eroded. Respect was wearing thin. The camaraderie that once defined them was gone. The album Let It Be, the final product of those sessions, was soaked in tension. You can hear it in the recordings. You can feel it in the film. The Beatles were falling apart in front of the world, and George's exit was the clearest sign of that collapse. But this wasn't the first time George felt sidelined. During the recording of the White Album, he had brought in songs like Not Guilty and Circles, only to see them rejected or left unfinished. He watched Paul lay down track after track, sometimes playing drums, bass, guitar, even vocals, everything, while George waited for a turn that rarely came. He began recording ideas outside of the Beatles. He built up a backlog of songs that would eventually become his masterpiece, All Things Must Pass. But in the Beatles' world, there was little room for his voice. He was stuck between two giants, John and Paul, and no matter how much he grew, they kept treating him like he hadn't. During the later sessions at Apple Studios, you can sense George pulling away. He's quieter, more distant, even when playing well. He brings in I Me Mine, a song clearly aimed at the selfishness he saw in the room. Ironically, John didn't even bother to show up for the recording of that track. George's frustration wasn't just musical, it was personal. He had grown close to Indian spirituality, was exploring different ways of life, seeking peace and meaning beyond fame. The Beatles' lifestyle, drugs, egos, pressure, felt increasingly empty to him. While John was consumed by avant-garde art and Paul by perfectionism, George was searching for truth. The conflict reached a peak when Phil Spector was brought in to salvage the Let It Be tapes. George welcomed Spector's involvement, hoping for some structure. But even then, the final product felt like a compromise. The Beatles didn't sound like a band anymore. They sounded like four men trying to coexist in a studio. When Let It Be was finally released in 1970, it was clear the Beatles were finished. George's departure during the Get Back sessions had been a warning shot, and though he returned, the band never recovered from that moment. The walkout was more than a dramatic gesture, it was a declaration. George was done being silent. In the years after the breakup, George's solo work flourished. All Things Must Pass was critically acclaimed. It showed the world what he had been holding back all those years. While John and Paul kept feuding in public, George quietly proved that he had always been more than just the quiet Beatle.